If your enemy is drowning, what should you do? Well, I would not recommend throwing him a flotation device. And that may be the central lesson for today. You would be forgiven if you thought that a shadow war is underway in Europe, be it the various incursions of Russian decoy drones flying past Ukraine, or the Russian fighter jets over the Baltic, or the smaller drones suspiciously hovering over airports, or the more bizarre but foiled conspiracies to pack food cans with explosives. The mystery that remains, though, is what the heck Russia is trying to accomplish with this strategy. It would be tempting to conclude that Russia wants to deter Europe from providing further aid to Ukraine. But Europe is not participating in kinetic strikes against Russia, nor is Europe developing a habit of violating Russian airspace. Predictably, Russia's actions have only encouraged Europe to coordinate a response. It would also be tempting to conclude that Russia wants Europe to hoard its own air defenses and not donate them to Ukraine. But that strategy would require Europe to willfully ignore the bigger strategic picture. And, predictably, the European capitals are not. They are investing more in air defense technology to create more resources for everyone, Ukraine included. Many in Poland, the country most affected of the bunch, actually want to set up a no-fly zone in Ukraine, because that is the best location to deal with the problem. European capitals are also turning to Ukraine to procure the shields that Ukrainian defense companies have developed over the last 3 years, allowing them to expand their operations, and providing an economic lifeline that Ukraine rarely receives. It also does not explain why Russia is engaging in the other sabotage operations. And while I cannot confidently tell you that I know the real reason, I can say there is another possibility that has not received enough discussion. Moreover, if this is Russia's plan, then I am, and everyone else is, intentionally not supposed to know how to respond either. But that is a complicated strategic point for later. For now, the main point is that perhaps Russia is doing this to intentionally bait a counterattack. It is an idea that I floated before in the immediate aftermath of the MiG incursion over Estonian airspace. But now that we are seeing a further progression of incursions, I think it is time to do a deep dive behind the Kremlin's potential logic. So, today, I want to give an overview of Russia's current position in the war, how Russia has been pursuing this war under some significant, if underappreciated, domestic political constraints, and what might happen if the West incorrectly responds to Russian provocations. But we begin with the current situation for Russia. And as a preliminary, let me add a caveat. If you want to get a lot of views, it is a good idea to declare that Russia is done twice a week, every week. Actually, gotta really put some effort into it. Russia is done. And now that it is in big bold letters, you know that what I am saying must be true. Well, except Russia is not done. Yes, there are a lot of bad things happening in Russia right now, and I would graciously pass on any employment opportunities today in the Kremlin if I were a patriotic Russian. But despite years of misleading claims to the contrary, Putin continues presiding over both the country and the war effort. Russia still occupies a significant chunk of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, and it will be difficult for Kyiv to unstick the Russian forces there. Thus, the reality falls somewhere in between. Things are going fine, but not great for the Kremlin. And the more of these incursions we see, the more it suggests that things are a notch worse for the Kremlin, even if the situation is far from catastrophic. The top-line numbers do not look great. Russia continues its plotting offensive, with the pace slowing in September, and at a time when things are about to get slower due to seasonal changes in weather patterns. All reports indicate that Russia is losing a ton of metal and taking heavy casualties to capture that territory. And after 2 years of sustaining this offensive, there has been no significant collapse to Ukraine's front lines that would cause a significant domino problem. Meanwhile, the Kremlin continues needing to raise wages to convince more contract soldiers to sign on the dotted line, though we have discussed before how such recruitment strategies dilute out more ideologically committed soldiers, and therefore result in worse battlefield performance. You can see the recruitment problems by looking past Russia. North Korea's participation in Russia's defense of Kursk is well known. However, the more recent revelation is the large presence of Cuban mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. Ukrainian intelligence puts the number at 20,000. Meanwhile, U.S. patience with the Kremlin on a path toward peace seems to have come to an end, and the Russian stock market just hit a 3-year low. Back at home, the headlines regarding Ukraine's economic warfare have become inescapable. At the risk of showing 2 timelines in one video, let's sit back and watch every strike on a pipeline, terminal, or oil refinery since the beginning of August. You really get a feel for the scope of Ukraine's strategy as all of the X's populate the screen. And keep in mind that Ukraine did the majority of this without U.S. intelligence on Russia's defenses, which it just started to receive. Russia is now having to import gasoline to satisfy domestic demand. The combined result of attrition on the front and sabotage at home is that the Kremlin is experiencing an economic shortfall. You have to do something to compensate, and the Kremlin's answer is to raise taxes. Its value-added tax will go from 20% to 22%, among other measures. So your average Russian now faces higher taxes and a fuel shortage, combined with all of the other restrictions that sanctions have brought about over the course of almost 4 years. None of this is an outright emergency for the Kremlin, but it is not looking good. It violates one of the core tenets of Russia's social contract. The Kremlin will conduct foreign policy as it pleases, as long as the average Russian does not have to internalize any of the consequences that come along with such adventurism. It also helps explain why all of this is happening now. The status quo in Ukraine is not particularly great for the Kremlin. Something needs to change if Putin is going to walk away from the situation with a good outcome, and hence we are seeing all of this happening. But that still does not explain what Russia's endgame is here. To make progress on the master plan question, let's talk about the manner in which Russia has pursued the war so far. I think a good way to frame this is the frequent discussions you will hear in European capitals about how long it will take for Russia to be ready to invade a NATO country. The most common time frame you will hear is 5 years, though that keeps resetting every month Russia continues pushing in Ukraine. In theory, the delay gives Russia enough time to reconstitute its forces and replenish its warehouses with materiel. Now, in the past, I have been critical of that time frame because it underestimates the liability of maintaining a hostile front line with Ukraine. Even if the active firefight comes to an end, Russia has now exposed itself along a gigantic new flank. To illustrate, if the Kremlin were to order an attack on Estonia, and did not have Ukraine on complete lockdown, NATO would then bring a major fight to the Baltics, and Kyiv would take advantage of Russia's distraction by trying to reclaim some of its eastern territories. But let me now argue the opposite point. I also think that 5 years may be an overestimate, depending on how effective the Kremlin's propaganda machine is. Let's go back to what is causing the delay: Russia's need to reconstitute its forces and replenish its warehouses. Well, there is no getting around the materiel problem. There is no secret political solution to conjuring more metal out of thin air. But the need for Russia to reconstitute its forces is misleading. In fact, Russia has a gigantic number of forces already sitting in Russia, twiddling their thumbs. There may be about 500,000 such soldiers on active duty, and up to 2 million more in the reserves. There's your force. No need to reconstitute anything lost in Ukraine. Go have fun in Europe. Heck, even during the war, Russia has continued to conscript hundreds of thousands of soldiers twice annually to maintain those ranks. Perhaps you heard about the most recent drive from September: 135,000, up 16% year over year, and the largest class since 2016. Now, this might all seem baffling. Russia has well north of 2 million soldiers not doing anything terribly important, perhaps allegedly protecting the country from invasion, but no one is about to try that. Meanwhile, you have a very slow pace of progression in Ukraine. To put this in perspective, if you take 400 square kilometers and form it into an actual square 20 kilometers aside, You get a distance that Pete Hegseth thinks every US Army general should be able to run from one end to the other in less than 2 hours. So why aren't there 2 million more Russian soldiers in Ukraine? I mean, the Kremlin must be stupid, right? Well, the problem is that there is a good chance that the Kremlin would face an economic collapse or an uprising on the streets if it tried doing anything of the sort. And we know this directly from what Russia experienced in September 2022. In the middle of the chaos surrounding Ukraine's fall counteroffensive of that year, Russia tried mobilizing 300,000 of those soldiers. There was this big fancy televised announcement that you are watching here and everything. But there was no patriotic response. Rather, men fled the country. They hid in vacation homes. They bribed conscripting officers to the best of their abilities. They did not want to go to Ukraine. It was perhaps the most dangerous moment in Putin's political career. It broke the social contract. The population was not willing to play along back then, and they are still not willing to play along now. So the Kremlin shifted to hiring soldiers at a market rate, and has continued with that strategy ever since. This is why the pool of 2 million plus soldiers remains sitting in Russia. They are conscripted into protecting the homeland, but that is it. Because going any further went so poorly the last time that the Kremlin really, really wants to avoid a repeat. Now we can get to Putin's potential master plan. The Kremlin's financial situation is not looking great. Yes, ending the mobilization policy partially restored the social contract, but inflation, fuel disruption, higher taxes, and everything else are all collectively infringing on it again. Simultaneously, the Kremlin is dissatisfied with where the war is going. At the start, the folks in Moscow imagined a line that looked like this. Instead, it is roughly here. The solution is to get some of those 2 million plus soldiers to Ukraine. The catch is doing it without fomenting a revolution at your doorstep. What to do? Well, this is where Russia's potential NATO scheme comes into play. From the start, the Kremlin has framed the Ukraine war as a battle between Russia and NATO. This has been a sensible political decision. There are still enough people in Russia who remember the days when Western Europe was an existential threat to the Soviet system. And those fears have passed from generation to some degree. So the more that you can convince Russians that NATO is disguising itself as Ukraine, just waiting to invade Russia, the better. But there is a problem with that narrative. It's not what is happening. Ukraine gets plenty of support from NATO countries, of course, but Ukraine is not part of NATO, though we can all spend a moment appreciating how the invasion has simultaneously clouded Ukraine's path toward NATO membership while increasing bilateral relations. Nevertheless, there is a perception out there that Russia is an autocratic state, and that the Kremlin uses its control over the media to bend public beliefs at will. But that is also not true. This is not the era of the Soviet Union, where Russians might only get their Pravda from, well, Pravda. Fast forward to today, and now if you run Pravda, you have to worry about falling out of a 7th floor window. People can get their information from the internet in Russia, even if the web exists in a somewhat regulated form there. Russian expats are all over the world and can communicate to their families who are still at home. Sure, the Kremlin can bend the airwaves, but this is not a totalitarian situation like North Korea is. So, no, the Kremlin cannot just conjure up a war between Russia and NATO. The Russian media can harp about the connections between NATO and Ukraine, but there are just not enough Russians buying the NATO threat. Not enough to support the 2022 mobilization. Not enough to believe that the 4 Ukrainian oblasts are actually a part of Russia, no matter what the Federation law says, and therefore need to be protected like the rest of the homeland. And not even enough to want to defend Kursk, part of the actual homeland, from invading Ukrainians. If the Kremlin wants to convince the broader Russian population that NATO is participating in the war, then NATO actually needs to start participating in the war. So when we look back at all of these incursions, what we may be witnessing is the Kremlin's attempt to bait just that. prod NATO countries with enough drones that they might just bomb a launch site. Have enough MiGs fly into NATO airspace, and maybe one of them will be shot down. And that is the evidence that the Kremlin needs to convince the domestic doubters of NATO's warmongering tendencies, or whatever they want to call it. This is something that my academic alter ego was once interested in. The context back then was with militant groups, but the basic logic applies here as well. One party takes a provocative action, hoping that the other will overreact. The dilemma for the actor under attack is how extensively to respond. For example, if Russia's public is potentially sympathetic to the idea that NATO is a security threat, then aggressively retaliating would backfire. But if the Russian public is just tired of the Kremlin's antics, then a sweeping response will debilitate Russia without causing a deeper problem. The tricky part is that the Kremlin, situated in Russia, tends to have a better idea of how Russians will respond than Western outsiders. Right now, it seems that NATO is betting that the more conservative option is the superior response. But what is interesting about this restraint thus far is that it may be for the betterment of Ukraine. You see, if NATO did take stronger measures while not doing something ridiculous like invading up north, I would not expect Russia to counter by making NATO countries the primary focus of its next steps. Rather, the Kremlin has made clear that it values capturing Ukraine more than any of its other priorities. If a NATO response allowed the Kremlin to mobilize its forces, I would expect those Russians to mostly funnel into Ukraine. Or the Kremlin is in a weaker position. The incursions are intended to give NATO a black eye, with the hope that NATO will be cautious given the uncertainty surrounding its decision. That is the fun of international relations. We never really know what is happening. Meanwhile, you always know what is happening when you see this image. It signals the end of the video, with these two excellent books about the war being the only things left to discuss. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.